address for that will be shown later in the slideshow. We also can take, of course, hard copy comments. And for those who would like to comment in person, there will be a public meeting on October 2nd at the county the County Board of Supervisors Chambers at 701 Ocean Street. That meeting begins at 6 o'clock on October 2nd. So we invite comment then as well. Today's meeting is more informational. Comments are best taken either in writing or on October 2nd, but of course we are here to listen. I'd like to make a few introductions. The county staff today is Kathy Prevasic, the planning director. I am Paya Levine, the Assistant Planning Director. Matt Johnston is the environmental coordinator. We also have in the room Robin Bolster, who is the Cannabis Licensing Manager, and Loretta Moreno, who is the Cannabis Resource Planner. Our counsel is here as well. And then I would like to introduce two of the consultants who prepared the draft environmental impact report. They are with AMEC Foster Wheeler of Santa Barbara. Doug McFarling is here, and Erica Leachman. And Erica will be providing the presentation today. Yes, I think that's a good place.
Thank you so much, Paya. And thank you all so much for having us today and taking the time to learn about the program and hear from the county staff, our team, and the public on this matter. First, just a little bit of background for those who are curious about how we got to where we are. Cannabis, and specifically the regulation of cannabis, is a long, complex history in the state of California, going back probably most significantly to 2015 with the adoption of the medical marijuana regulations of the state, colloquially known as MRSA. That's been a regulatory system for a number of years now and has governed everything from dispensaries to cultivation, manufacturing, et cetera, and has involved regulation of those activities. Most recently, in 2016, recreational use for cannabis was approved by voters in California as well. In between those two times, the County of Santa Cruz has taken a variety of approaches to regulating cannabis activities locally, including adoption of chapters of the Santa Cruz County Municipal Code, County Code. Most recently, the program involves changes to the municipal code as well, the county code, specifically to be consistent with state law and to address local concerns about cannabis cultivation and manufacturing. So where we are right now, as you can see in the background, is the proposal to replace Chapter 7.128 of the Santa Cruz County Code with new regulations going forward for cannabis activities in the county. The program is, in essence, a licensing and regulation program. So licensing meaning that you need a license in order to either cultivate or manufacture cannabis products commercially. I should note it's a bullet at the end of the list, but I think I want to highlight this up front, that this program doesn't address personal use. So if it's personal use under the Adult Use of Marijuana Act adopted in 2016. This program is not about that. This is only about those folks who want to cultivate or manufacture commercially and make money doing it. The program involves a range of criteria for the licensing, who's eligible. With licensing, not everybody is eligible for a license. There's a range of criteria that applies and would select certain people who meet the criteria, who then become eligible for a license to either cultivate or manufacture or both. Eligibility is largely derived from zoning. So there are certain zoning districts that are eligible for the different activities and those that are not. Within the zoning districts that are eligible, there's also a proposed range of additional criteria, including the size of your parcel, the location in the context of the whole of the county, which supervisorial district you're in, the type and intensity and productivity of the use that you're proposing. So things such as canopy size would be a limiting factor for how much cannabis you could grow commercially, where you could grow it. All those factors are included in the program. It would make each license essentially a custom job. So each license would have its own unique set of criteria that would be in compliance with the program. The regulations also address site development, so the appropriateness of the site, and then if, depending on what is being proposed for each individual site, a range of criteria, best management practices, expectations about noise and odor, and limitations to those potential nuisances that would control how cannabis activities are performed on individual sites. And as I mentioned, it doesn't include personal use. So the program addresses two main cannabis activities, the first being cultivation. For cultivation, commercial cultivation would only be allowed in the zoning districts listed up here. So specifically agricultural zoning districts, the industrial zoning districts, and then also the special use and timber production zoning districts in the county. It would not be allowed in residential or other more retail, commercial, and those types of zoning districts. It would only be something along the spectrum of industrial and service commercial. The program for cultivation also includes a range of development standards that restrict the eligibility, as I mentioned before. And for the purposes of the EIR only, the EIR considers two different scenarios, two regulatory scenarios, one of them being the project that was considered and initiated by the County Board of Supervisors, and then also we're called the more permissive project, something that kind of pushes the envelope a little bit more to say, what would happen if we made it easier to get a license? There are more locations that would be eligible as opposed to fewer. If you could have a smaller parcel size, for example, what are the environmental trade-offs between the two? So as I mentioned, for the EIR specifically, having that juxtaposition of impact analysis is helpful for decision making, but ultimately the program will eventually involve just one set of regulations. So I want to point that out and make that clear that you can't have two different sets of regulations. The EIR is just looking at the two options to help inform decision making. In general, the more permissive project does things that, as I mentioned, increase the area that is eligible for licensing by decreasing the required parcel size, so you can do commercial activities on smaller parcels, decreasing setbacks from features so that you have more area that you could use for cannabis activities, and overall it makes there more opportunity for licensing within the county. And you can see this reflected in the project maps. These are figures from the EIR, so if you're having trouble seeing on the screen some of the details, because it's a county-wide map, so you're not going to be able to see too much. But the point of these maps is to demonstrate what areas are eligible for what types of licensing. So under the project scenario, cultivation would be allowed in any of the big colored areas, the green or the orange. The distinction is that in the green area, you could do outdoor, indoor, greenhouse, any of those types of cultivation. In the orange area, the project would restrict cultivation to indoor cultivation only, no outdoor. And in contrast, the difference is slight, but you'll see in this map for the more permissive project, not only can you do all the different types of cultivation in all of the eligible areas, it's green all over, but the area is also a little bit larger, about 2,000 acres larger than the project scenario. The second cannabis activity that the program addresses is cannabis manufacturing. Product manufacturing it takes a variety of forms, but it ranges from very low volatility, simple washing of the material to extract the cannabis properties using water and a washing machine, up to something that's much more volatile and intensive using you'll see these reflected in the EIR, but a CO2 closed loop manufacturing process that requires more energy and has some additional risks associated with it. So the EIR looks at all the different ranges of manufacturing types that would be available for licensing in the county, and similar to the cultivation program, limits those activities to specific zoning districts. In this case, the zoning districts that are eligible for cultivation are eligible, but then also the program provides the opportunity to do cannabis home occupation level of manufacturing, which cannabis home occupation is a level of manufacturing that is very, very low risk, very limited in scale and productivity. So it's something that is akin to other home occupations, something like making jam, something like that, where the business is not something that exceeds what would be normal for another home-based business. The cannabis home-based business is only allowed in detached single-family homes and in some residential zonings, and would be subject to the limitations of the program. So with the overview of the program, I encourage everyone to read the project description, of course. It has much more detail than we're able to present today, but that gives you a pretty good overview of the mechanisms, how the program works, and what potential licensees would be expected to be held to going forward. And turning now to the EIR itself, we want to discuss just briefly what an EIR is for anybody who hasn't seen one of these big documents before. At its heart, it's an informational document. It's a disclosure document. It's a document that goes through a whole range of resources, different issues, different concerns in the community from a physical environmental perspective, and discloses to the public and the decision makers for a project what the potential environmental effects could be, the physical environmental effects could be, so that that's factored into decision making. It's a really helpful tool to bring together a wide range of multidisciplinary topics and consolidate them into one big document, which is why often they can be so large. But in doing so, it's a great resource to have one place to go to find that information. In addition to disclosing what the potential impacts would be, CEQA, which is the California Environmental Quality Act, requires that for any potentially significant impact, that you identify mitigation measures, options for things that you could do to lessen or eliminate the potentially significant impact, which our EIR does. In addition, the last key role of an EIR is to identify alternatives to the program. So we looked at 2 scenarios as part of the project. We also looked at 2 additional scenarios in the alternatives to compare even more and even further what would happen under different regulatory scenarios to inform the decision making. In addition, we also look at a no project scenario. This is a requirement under CEQA to say, what if we don't do anything, what would happen? So that you'll see that reflected in Chapter 4 of the document as well. Ultimately, the EIR must be certified before a project can be adopted in California. So if a project is subject to an EIR, you can't adopt the project and start working on it until the Board of Supervisors or the lead agency decision makers certify the document. So what we have today is a draft of the document. It's not certified. It's available for public review, and certification will come later in the process once the document has received review, public comments, and is then certified by the board in the future. One thing to note, as mentioned, the EIR does not approve anything. So the fact that we have information about these different project scenarios does not mean that anything is done or set in stone, or that the decision-making process that's in front of us won't modify these programs even further. One benefit of the EIR as it's currently drafted is that the range of regulatory scenarios is wide, and so in the end, any of these scenarios that we've looked at in the EIR are on the table. So I think that's something to keep in mind, is that the EIR is supposed to provide information to help decision making, but it itself does not make decisions for any of the decision making bodies. And also to provide context of where we are in the EIR process. An EIR it's governed by state law, and so the steps that we take are similar to any EIR process. Back in February and March of this year, we conducted the notice of preparation and scoping. Scoping is basically reaching out to the public and interested agencies to hear what the EIR should look at. What are the key issues related to the program? We conducted the environmental impact analysis and published the public draft EIR over the summer. It was released last Thursday and is available on the county's website and local libraries and at the county planning department. And we're currently in the 45-day public comment period. This is mandatory under state law, and we'll be having a public hearing to receive oral testimony on the project on October 2nd. So we'll have details about that at the end of the presentation. Looking ahead, after the public comment period closes, our job is to respond to the comments that we receive, make modifications to the final EIR in response to those comments, and then take that final draft EIR and present it to the Board of Supervisors for certification and consideration of the whole of the program. So for our EIR scope, we considered basically 3 things. The adoption of the program involves 3 main components: the amendments to the county code to set up the licensing program and propose a range of regulations for commercial cannabis manufacturing and cultivation in the county. It also includes proposed amendments to the general plan and local coaster program, And at the end of the day, a licensing program that's going to be ongoing and managed by the county under the County Cannabis Licensing Office that ensures that the regulations that are adopted in the county code are implemented on a case-by-case basis for every license that's issued and maintained in the county. One thing I want to mention is that the amendments to the general plan and the local coastal plan and the amendments to the county code are ongoing. You know, since we're looking at a range of regulations, the actual text, the final version, those things have to go through iterations with the board. We've included a draft of those in Appendix C of the document, but that's where the rubber hits the road through the analysis and the decision making. And so those documents, while available, will go through the public planning process through the end of the year and become final documents later on. As I mentioned, an EIR analyzes physical impacts to the environment. And one important aspect of that analysis is establishing what you're comparing the changes to. A change is always from some sort of setting, some sort of baseline. And what CEQA is pretty clear about is that in setting up your analysis, you have to disclose what the baseline is. I think using a simple example, if you're developing a building on a vacant lot, the existing setting is a vacant lot, the proposed project is putting a building on it, and you compare the two. For cannabis, it's actually quite interesting environmental baseline because, as many of us know, cannabis it exists currently. It's something that is part of the community. It's something that's been a part of a community for decades, maybe more. And that's something that, you know, we're generally aware of, but then we also heard from the existing cannabis industry. Early in the EIR process, our team reached out to a range of existing cultivators, existing manufacturers in the county to get a handle on what the baseline is, so that we weren't starting with, oh, there's no cannabis out there, and then saying, okay, the impacts of the program are all of this legalization of cannabis activities. We wanted to try and characterize what's happening right now so we could also quantify what would happen under the program in the future. So that really started with the notice of preparation in February, when the outreach happened, when we heard about, when we reached out to the cannabis industry and the public about what are the current activities ongoing in the county. We looked at the number, the types, where, what settings, what constraints the existing cannabis growers and cultivators were dealing with, some of the issues associated with them, some of the harms that had happened to the public in the past, and characterize that environmental baseline as best as possible. You'll notice in the document in section 3, in chapter 3, that we do our best to characterize and capture what we know is happening out there, but there's also lots that we don't know. And with CEQA, that's kind of a rule of thumb, is that you say what you know, do your best to characterize what's happening under existing conditions, and move on from there. And from that baseline, the EIR analyzes the changes from it. So what would happen in the future under a licensing program compared to what would happen now? It involves change, it involves moving, includes closure of some sites, moving of others, and ultimately, at the end of the day, licenses only being issued in the areas in those maps, in the green areas, and in one case, the orange areas of those maps. At the end of the day, the EIR classifies the impacts. So after considering a range of resources, makes a finding about whether the impact is significant and unavoidable, if it can be less than significant with a mitigation measure or two or more, if it's less than significant on its face, existing, there's no problem, there might be change, but it's not a significant effect. Or if there's no impact, or in fact a beneficial impact, if there's something about the program that would improve the environment or wouldn't even trigger a concern, that's also documented in the document as well. The analysis also addresses both the indirect and direct effects of the project. For this program, we looked at the direct effects of cultivation and manufacturing, and also the indirect effects of other development that would have to happen to support cultivation and manufacturing, development of homes or development of new buildings, water infrastructure, those types of things, which isn't something that the program addresses, but it would have to happen in order for the program to happen. We also looked at the cumulative impacts of the program, considering the regulations for cannabis in adjoining communities in Watsonville, over the hill, San Mateo, and the like. And then also, one unique characteristic of this EIR is that we looked at secondary impacts. And secondary impacts throughout the document are addressed related to what we know will be an ongoing, unregulated cannabis industry. The licensing program is available, but there is very little that the county or really anyone can do in California to ensure that every single commercial cannabis operator gets a license. It's a goal, but knowing that the regulatory environment has an impact on whether or not people who are cultivating or manufacturing illegally or in an unregulated setting would come to the county to seek a license. That's considered as part of this document and isolated in sections referred to as secondary impacts. So just briefly, what I also want to mention is that a great resource in the document is the executive summary. It's a large document and it's great reading, if I might suggest it. But for a broad brush overview, the executive summary at the top of the document gives a nice, succinct summary of how the whole program works, what the range of impacts are, what mitigation measures are suggested and recommended to the county to adopt to address those impacts, and then also a summary of the alternatives analysis, et cetera. So I would start there, and then if something piques your interest, go to the actual resource area to see how we got there. As an overview, we looked at aesthetics, including public views, the character of neighborhoods, light and glare, the impacts to vegetation from cannabis cultivation and manufacturing. We looked at agriculture, timber resources, specifically the conversion of those resources away from their core purpose, timber, to cannabis. Is it an issue? We also looked at air quality. Surprisingly, in this analysis, air quality has impacts related to transportation, because the vehicle trips and the amount of driving that's associated with any commercial industry, but in this case, commercial product and manufacturing industry, has a lot of impacts, has a lot of trips associated with it. We looked at biological resources, mostly from a land clearing perspective. Cultural resources, similarly, in the case of reuse of historic structures that aren't currently registered anywhere, it would be something that may come up of an unknown historic structure. In terms of geology and soils, we looked at grading and terracing. Terracing is a fairly common practice in the Santa Cruz Mountains because of the terrain, in order to create level pads to cultivate or construct buildings. It's common, and so it's something that we look at and propose mitigation measures for how best to go about grading for cannabis activities. We also look at greenhouse gas emissions similar to air quality. Hazardous and hazardous materials focus mostly on the use of pesticides and herbicides, and also the risk of explosion and fires. As you can imagine, many of the potential licensees and registrants are located in areas of the counties that is in high fire zones and in more remote and rural places that are relatively inaccessible. So this section looks at that topic. We looked also at hydrology, water quality, mostly from runoff and also from groundwater draw in agricultural areas and in rural areas. Water is not municipal. It's something that is provided on site, either through wells or stream diversions, that type of thing. And so the section looks at that. We also looked at public services and population and housing to understand how an uptick in employment related to the industry over time may have an effect on the demand for public services, fire, police, et cetera, and then also the demand for housing in the community, including farm worker and employee housing. And last but not least, we looked at transportation, circulation, both from a trips perspective, how much trip generation will we see, and then almost more intensely, the safety concerns and circulation issues, and accessibility, making sure that that folks and employees can reach sites appropriately, and that emergency services can respond in a timely way in more rural areas of the county. And we also looked at utilities, energy conservation. For indoor cultivation specifically, it draws a lot of energy. And while at the end of the day we found that the energy supply was sufficient and that energy conservation measures were feasible for the program, we disclosed how much energy this program is likely to demand. And one thing just to notice is there's two topics that were scoped out of the document. Noise and minerals end up being in a section called Other Sequel. We addressed them, but it doesn't get a full review because through the scoping process, these topics didn't raise the concern that there could be potentially significant impacts. As a summary, there's two topics that no mitigation is required. Existing county code and standards, mean that the resource is less than significant, that the impacts that we identified don't need additional mitigation. But a range of resources do, that the impacts would be potentially significant if something wasn't done to address the impact. So most resources you're going to see have recommended mitigation measures and required mitigation measures in order to change the conclusion from significant impact to less than significant. Only 2 topics from the program perspective have significant unavoidable impacts, and it's mostly related to vehicle emissions. Air quality and then the trips associated with transportation have a potential to exacerbate existing poor operations on roadways, including Highway 101 and some of the mountain highways, Highway 9 and Highway 17, 126, 152, that currently experience pretty severe congestion and under the existing setting. And given the location of where we understand the licenses to occur, there's a possibility that that additional employment associated with the industry would exacerbate those problems and lead to significant impacts. As I mentioned, secondary impacts related to the unregulated cannabis activities that are foreseeable in the future under this program are significant and unavoidable in any situation. What we found is that there's very little that can be done aside from enforcement. Ramped up enforcement and ongoing checking in and surveys to see how the program is performing to bring people out of an unregulated environment and seeking licenses. And so in that situation, because that's really where the impact happens, the unregulated, drawing water from streams, unregulated grading, those types of things, those are all potentially significant impacts. The one exception was aesthetics and visual resources, because what we found from talking to the county sheriff and the enforcement the code enforcement department is that when you can see it, it gets reported and shut down and repaired. So in terms of visual resources, that's the one place where we can say, okay, the secondary unregulated environment is likely going to mitigate itself, because if it's having a visual impact, we can address it. The program also looked at, as I mentioned, 3 alternatives, one being the no project, the continuation of the existing regulations in the county. We looked at 2 different regulatory scenarios for the alternatives 1 and 2, one being the most restrictive project, which constrains the areas that you could get a license even further than the project, makes it focus mostly down in the South County and urban, like the Live Oak area, from there down south. And alternative 2 was a most permissive alternative, which expands the area and diffuses the demand across a greater area of the county. One thing I should mention is that the program would give licenses to people who registered during a registration period in late 2016 and would not be available to anybody who didn't. And so the total number of potential licensees is a fixed number, and the program basically reconfigures them. If they're spread out under alternative 2, it would be all over the county. If it's alternative 1, it would be consolidated into a smaller area of the county, but the total number is assumed to be very similar. At the end of the day, after the analysis was performed, the draft EIR concludes that alternative 2, the most permissive alternative, is the environmentally superior alternative, mostly because of that concept that by diffusing those impacts into areas of the county and not consolidating them in one particular area, comparatively the impact is slightly less. And so while you'll see in the analysis the findings are very similar, this one rose to the surface as the one that would be environmentally superior overall.
Can I just interrupt you and ask one question?
Of course, yeah.
That's confusing me. Is the most permissive project distinct from the more permissive project?
It is, yes, and thank you, yes, yeah, and I can clarify on that. The most permissive project takes the development standards that are proposed, including minimum parcel size, amount of canopy, the overall locations, and makes it more permissive. You can have smaller parcels, so more parcels will become eligible for licensing, which overall increases the overall acreage in the county that you could do cannabis activities. So I don't have the maps in the presentation, but in Chapter 4, you'll see comparative maps to show how that area of eligibility grows or shrinks under each alternative, and that's really the mechanism to control how many and where cannabis activities would occur in the county.
And
great.
Just one note, one of the key differences about the most permissive alternative is increased potential for co-location. Mm-hmm. So, and co-location would not be subject to the cap on canopy sizes, whereas the more permissive alternative, you can co-locate, but on a parcel you're still held to your 10,000, 22,000, whatever the cap is for that zoning district. And the most permissive doesn't. One other note is just that in addition to registrants, the board provided that farmers who had been farming at least 3 years prior to the registration are also eligible to apply for a license in the future. So existing greenhouses in South County, those farmers didn't have to register, and Erica can tell you more about that.
That's right. That's absolutely right, yeah.
And just for clarification, as we're reading through this, so in the project in Chapter 2 is being kind of analyzed side by side with the more permissive project.
That's correct.
Right.
Yes.
And then the most permissive project is in the alternatives chapter.
That's correct,
Okay,
yeah. You'll
great,
see
thank you.
throughout the core of the document, which is Chapter 3, the more permissive project and the project scenario are addressed side by side, exactly.
And there's another most permissive.
That's
Okay,
correct.
Great, got
That's
it.
right.
Thank
That
you.
compares the whole scenario against the project and the more permissive project. Great. So with that as a overview of where we are, and then as Paya mentioned, we're in the middle of the public, or we just kicked off the public comment period. We'll be taking public comments on the document until October 16th at 5 o'clock. We encourage the comments to be focused on the overall adequacy of the EIR and your opinions about the alternatives being analyzed, both from the project more permissive project in the core of the document, and also the alternatives analysis. And we hope and encourage that the comments remain focused on the environmental impacts of the program, because that's most helpful to us in order to respond and adjust the analysis appropriately before we make the recommendation to the board. To submit comments, you can fill out a comment card or mail a letter to Matt Johnston, who's right here. His address is up on the board here. Or if it's easier, you can email the Cannabis EIR at santacruzcounty.us. It's a specific email address just for this project, so all those communications will go into one email box. And looking ahead, what we can look forward to on October 2nd is the public comment hearing on the EIR from 6 to 8. It'll be at the board chambers on Ocean Street on the 5th floor. Go up the elevator. After the comment period closes in October, we'll be looking to publish the final EIR with the response to comments in November, and get to public hearings and certification of the EIR and adoption of the program in December of this year. So it's a quick turnaround. I hope everyone can attend the public hearing on the 2nd. And thank you so much. We're available for questions.
Thank you. So I think maybe we'll start with some, if there are any initial questions from the commissions, then go to the public, and then we can finish up by any additional questions or comments by the commission, and then close it out if that works for everybody. Yeah, okay. So, does anybody want to start? And if there are none, we can go straight to the public.
I would prefer to hear from the public at this time.
No questions? Okay, so we can open it up to the public. If there are members of the public who would like to come up and address the commission, please come forward.
Chair Dan, how much time do you want to give for each one?
How many folks want to make comments? I don't think I'll need to use the timer if there's
Okay.
not that many folks here, but I'd just say try to keep your comments to under 5 minutes. Thank you.
Good morning. Good morning. My name is Kevin Collins. I live in the 5th District, and I live in one of these zonings that's going to be open, RA. And the first thing I'd like to explain, if none of you live in the rural areas of the county, is that RA is not really an agricultural district. In the 5th District, most of it is redwood forest with a house on it. So there's going to be a large conversion of forest to open land, in other words, clearing. There's already extensive clearing of chaparral and other hillsides, other kinds of vegetation. Once a pot moved outdoors, in other words, once it was no longer being produced inside buildings primarily, which wasn't that long ago, suddenly the impacts on the landscape became very obvious and dramatic. Up where I live, there were, within a mile of my house, there have been at least 6 grows only one of which would have met any of the standards in this document, proposed in the ordinances. We've had at least 6 wells dropped into the streams. We've had open bonfires on sites. We've had little bitsy substandard lots being used, ATVs being used to access these sites. And I'd like to jump right into the ordinance itself. I think there's this quite remarkable final clause. Nothing in the chapter shall be construed as imposing on the licensing official or the county of Santa Cruz any duty to issue a notice of violation, nor to abate any unlawful cannabis business activity, nor to take any other action with regard to the unlawful cannabis business activity, et cetera, blah, blah, blah. So, right out front, we're being informed that this will be treated kind of like environmental health treats septic inspection. There is no septic inspection in this county until the feces starts to pile up in someone's front yard. The planning department shows up to a violation once about 8 people have called and filed complaints, and then you take the risk of having your name being provided to the offending landowner, which happened to my wife, who was a county elected official at the time. So I'm extremely skeptical about the ability and the will of Santa Cruz County to actually enforce this 636 pages of supposition about what might happen if we turn the county into a production zone for large sections of California and the United States. I mean, the Sheriff's Department has already estimated to me on the phone that they suspect that there's in excess of 1,000 grow sites in this county right now before this ordinance before the EIR has even been looked at. So I won't go on and on about this right now, but I think this is, 636 pages of confetti. I've read many EIRs, and I know what they're about and to what extent they actually apply to the situation that results as in this case. This is entirely speculative. Anybody who wants to understand the impacts of this industry needs to go to Humboldt County, Mendocino County, Trinity County, and speak to the county boards of supervisors and the sheriff's departments in those parts of California, because the same thing is going to happen here. And if this were to be made fair to the rural residents of the county of Santa Cruz, it would be available to grow pot in R1 zoning. In other words, in the coastal plain street grid around us here. You could establish a minimum lot size, just as you're doing in RA, and inspect it. Thank you.
Thank you.
I just have 2 questions. My name's Sandy Barron. I'm a commissioner on the Fish and Wildlife County Commission. You said this was released last Thursday, but your comment period's going back to August. Can you tell me why that is?
Matt,
The end of
Matt,
August.
would you like
Thursday
to?
was August 31st.
Oh, aren't we?
It was the final day of August.
Oh, are we not in October now?
No, we're in September.
Okay, and then the other question is, what legal basis does the county have for limiting the number of licenses they're providing?
Yeah, I'm not sure what the process is for answering direct questions from the public in this kind of meeting. If you guys want to do that, or just if she wants to email staff later and answer that kind of question, or
I mean, that was a board of supervisors, discussed it and decided that the industry, at least initially, would be kept to those who have been active in the industry in Santa Cruz County already and existing farmers.
So if someone decides to bring it to court I just wondered if there was more, does the
I
supervisor?
think the local government has a lot of discretion and a lot of flexibility in whether or not they even choose to allow any cannabis activities at all within their jurisdiction, and if they do, how they want that to be carried out. So the state has given a lot of deference to local government to decide how they want to regulate the industry.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I was
Okay.
wondering if you could point to some law or.
It was this, the IUMA, right? That, or Prop 64?
So I
What are
think
we
in
under?
general, what Kathy is referring to is constitutional police power of local governments, and that's our basic regulatory power. And then the state laws dealing with the specific regulation of cultivation of cannabis also give us licensing authority.
You think that that could be applied to an agricultural product that's legal now?
It's specifically recognized in the state law, yes.
Thank you.
Hi. My name is Jim Coffis, and I'm from Ben Lomond. And I came here to learn and to hear about this. I didn't intend to say anything, but Kevin is a neighbor of mine. I also live up in the rural part of the county, and he made a comment, two comments really, that I wanted to add my voice to. And the first was that he called this a 636-page piece of confetti or something to that effect. And I wanted to say that I found, I dove in and out of the report all weekend, and I found it to be fascinating reading. I thought it was comprehensive. It's the most quantitative analysis I've ever seen of what the existing cannabis industry or trade looks like. So I give kudos to the team that put it together. I think it's a fine document and one that we can be proud of, and it will give us the framework to move on to reasonable regulations. The second thing that he said was, and this is a question I'd like to ask the consultants or whoever might be able to answer it, and that is, he mentioned the fact that, to be fair, R1 should be also allowed. And so I was curious why R1 was excluded from the conversation. Thank you.
The board articulated three primary objectives when they decided that they did want to regulate the cannabis industry. And neighborhood protection, protection, preservation of neighborhood character, residential character was one of them. And then, of course, protection and preservation of the environment to prevent environmental damage, and then to accommodate medical cannabis needs, to accommodate the industry. At the time, it was really for medical, but after that, in November, the voters passed and adult recreational use is going to be allowed, so this EIR doesn't distinguish anymore. But there are a lot of complaints that come from residential neighborhoods with respect to odor and security concerns, commercial activities in residential areas, and the board, I believe, felt that they were being responsive to try to prevent as much as possible those type of concerns in single-family neighborhoods.
Thank you, Kathy. Is there anyone else from the public who'd like to come forward and address the commissions? Okay, seeing no one, I'll bring it back to the commissions to see if there's questions or comments.
I don't really have any questions. I have to be honest, I have not read the entire document, just the
Yeah.
executive summary at this point and a little bit more of it, hoping to attend the meeting today to find out more information.
And I might suggest, since we have the time and it is a study session, that it might be helpful for you if Matt or the consultant or the team kind of walks you through the mitigation monitoring and reporting program. That's chapter 6, and that's just the compendium of all the mitigation measures by resource, topic area. And we don't have to talk through all of them, but maybe we could highlight ones that are of particular interest that help us sort of better explain, what the impacts were and how the program might change or mitigation measures added to it, if that would be helpful.
Yeah, I think that's great. I've managed to get through the beginning, the end, and I'm working on the middle, and I did have a couple of questions, so if I could maybe just ask them as you go along, that would be helpful for me. Okay.
Okay. Let me scoot up a little. In the chapter 6, it is alphabetical, we're going through it, and I'll go through some of the mitigations and kind of give you the background. The first mitigation deals with fencing and the visual impacts of fencing. In the initial regulations, there was a standard requirement for a 6-foot opaque fence surrounding all rows. And that can have impacts both from a visual, if you're in the middle of an ag field, it's a red thumb. If you're deep in the woods, it can be an expense that is not necessarily needed, and it can be a biotic impact. So what we've done is crafted a mitigation measure that puts the onus on the grower to develop their fencing plan and run it by the licensing official. So there's some flexibility, so that you can have for example, in the middle of an ag field, you might do shrubs that are in a visual screen with shrubs that can be moved, because as crop rotates, you don't want to have to move a $60,000 fence from one part of a parcel to another. So that combined with the visual blending of cannabis infrastructure really addresses the visual impacts of fencing. Visual blending of cannabis infrastructure can also include when you have structures that are going to be visible. You might have a certain paint style to blend into the background, and that again is something that is reviewed by the licensing official. One of the primary mitigations that, in terms of allowing this development in the rural areas, is to have some flexibility on where the development happens. Typically, we try and cluster everything. If you're on a timber parcel that already has a house on it but has a grow area that's not clustered, we want to have the flexibility to not clear trees in order to allow that use in another area. And that's where the siting allowance for new manufacturing structure development, that's where that comes in. So if you're doing some of you have a processing shed, or you're doing some limited manufacturing, we don't want to clear if you don't have to. So we'll allow the flexibility to have a more flexible plan. And that includes the development of houses. The land clearing restrictions, in order to try and reduce clearing as much as possible, we've included a mitigation. Right now, the current code requires a land clearing permit for anything an acre or above, and we're proposing to bring that down to a 1/4 acre. So we have a little more oversight over the clearings that are happening in the rural areas. One of the key mitigations for the secondary impacts, and this Erica referred to earlier, is a sustained enforcement program. We recognize that this industry is not going to be successful without enforcement. Currently, the licensing office has 2 dedicated enforcement officers, along with 2 resource planners who will be doing the primary enforcement on the active and licensed grows. They'll be working closely with the code enforcement staff in planning to look at the ones that are not active licensed grows. And we know that there are a lot of places that have been grown that have been left. There are a lot of people who are completely just off the record growing, and there's going to be a concerted effort to address that. The mitigation requires that we do annual monitoring and reporting of the type of enforcement that's being done, the type of grows that are out there, to the best of our knowledge, so we can track that and perhaps over time, as needed, get more resources to do that. I should say that the enforcement staff with the licensing office, and I know in my mind, it's one of the primary issues of the whole program. They have been working with the state. State has a task force to do enforcement, and there will be coordination between the Water Resources Board, the Fish and Game Commission, Fish and Game Board, and county staff.
Matt?
Yeah.
This was one where I had a question. I think I agree with you, this is a critical component. And I guess, developing a plan, the mitigation is that the Cannabis Licensing Office should develop and recommend blah, 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 a compliance program. And so I guess what I'm getting at this is they're gonna have two functions in the Cannabis Licensing Office, and that is to license legal grows, but then also to enforce to take the lead on enforcing the illegal grows. Is that right?
I believe,
I don't know.
yeah, it is going to be a combined effort.
Okay.
The code enforcement staff is going to be working hand in hand with the code enforcement staff in the licensing office.
Okay, yeah, that's part of my question. So the code enforcement that exists in the planning department is still gonna be involved with the Cannabis Licensing Office?
They will be involved, but they will not be involved in anything regarding the licensed grows. The licensed grows that are currently in the system will be completely regulated by the licensing staff.
Okay, but when we're talking about, if there's a complaint about an illegal grow, then both the Cannabis Licensing Office and code enforcement and planning will work together to do enforcement?
I think so. You know, we're going to be feeling our way through this. You know, it's and also it's true that a lot of cannabis cultivation and manufacturing activity occurs in buildings. So if it's illegal, it's likely that they may have an unpermitted structure as well, or haven't complied with the environmental regulations, which are the planning department handles. So there's going to be a lot of coordination.
And so is that gonna be fleshed out in this?
We have a county interdepartmental team that meets. In fact, we're meeting this afternoon. Now that the CIR is out, you know, we take a deep breath, and now that we've learned what we learned, we're going to be talking about what final regulations to end up proposing to the Planning Commission and the Board of Supervisors for final adoption. We'll be talking about some of the organizational challenges. You know, we meet with the DA, the sheriff, county council, planning, you know, just a whole host of departments.
Is there gonna be an analysis on staffing needs?
Yes.
Okay.
Most definitely. The other component, again, is the annual survey and monitoring report. And while it specifically will look at the code enforcement side, it will also look at things such as, I mean, the annual monitoring report is going to include issues with pesticide use, any type of violation of a permit, a license, will be addressed in the annual monitoring report. And there's a component for outreach. No, that's on another one. Sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. Yeah, when it comes to enforcement right now, one of the issues that we've had and that the sheriff has had, and one of the reasons I believe it has been, as Kevin mentioned, that the sheriffs are not necessarily enforcing, we're not enforcing, planning department is enforcing, we've had a gray area of what is legal and what is not. And once this is in place, this program that we're going to put together will help guide, and we'll work with the sheriff's department as well, where we can enforce and where we can't. Currently, if you're just cultivating illegally, it's a misdemeanor, but it can be elevated to a felony if there are other extenuating circumstances, such as illegal use of pesticides, illegal firearms, and other violations. So that's part of the enforcement program, and it will come with outreach to try and let people know if you are illegally growing and you're doing other things illegally as well, stream violations, it's not just a misdemeanor, it's a felony, and hopefully that can have some deterrent in terms of enforcement. We deal with mitigations for odors, and there's two types of odor mitigation. One is in the site plan. Every grow is going to have a site plan that will look at fencing, will look at the siting of your structures, will look at shared infrastructure as much as possible. And when it comes to odors, outdoor grows in particular can have a prevailing wind from a certain area, and one neighbor can get the brunt of that odor. So the plan is going to take into account prevailing winds and location on the site to the maximum extent feasible to try and reduce that impact. And that's going to be a site-by-site basis. In some areas, it's not going to be feasible to adjust it, but in areas where it is, we're going to try and make it so that it has a minimal impact as possible.
Can I ask a question about that?
Yeah.
Just because that has been probably the #1 neighborhood compatibility issue. How does that going to work if a site has been identified that that the licensing officer and the cultivator thinks is optimal, but then after the first season, it's determined there were complaints and whatever, and it's not optimal? What happens in that scenario?
Yeah, the licensing official has the ability to not renew a license. On an annual basis, the licenses have to be renewed. And so if there is a series of complaints, it definitely can be looked at, and our first response is not going to be to deny the license. It's going to be to look at what other feasible options there are to reduce that impact. And I'm speaking for Robin here, but I've had the conversation with her. First, we'll look to try and mitigate, to work with the neighbors to see if there's a way that we can reduce that impact. If nothing else will work, and it is a significant impact, then the license can be revoked.
Okay.
And in that case, I think we would try and work with the grower to identify another location if we can.
Okay.
The other part of the odors is with greenhouses, and greenhouses periodically have to be flushed of air because they get too humid in there. There's a requirement that when greenhouses are flushed, that the air be scrubbed before they are flushed. There are also siding requirements so that where the air is expelled is in the general course is not going directly towards a residential area. So we'll look at when greenhouses, which are one of the primary expansion areas that we identify, we don't expect them to flush their air all the time constantly because of the energy demand with that. But when the air is being, particularly in the harvest time, is being vented, there will be scrubbers to reduce the odor impacts from that. Moving down there are several mitigations around waste management. One of them is to prevent burning of the material waste, and the actual management of the waste is regulated by the state as well as by our county landfill. Is going to have to be set up to accept the type of waste. The state requirements, which we don't get too much into here, but we will be monitoring from a license standpoint. We encourage as much compost on site as possible. Where any waste product associated with cannabis is hauled off site, there are strict requirements in terms of weighing them, measuring what exactly you are disposing of. That's got to be on film. It's got to be detailed record keeping. Before it can be disposed of, it's got to be mulched with a non-cannabis product, at least 50% or more of the non-cannabis product. So the waste management is a really key component of both the licensing at the state and the local level. And burning obviously can have, if you have a lot of burn piles, and there is a lot of waste, particularly with the outdoor grows, there's a lot of fiber waste and a lot of soil waste. The soil is often, because we're not growing in the ground for the most part, the soil is used for a short, a round or two, and then it's either disposed of or has to be treated before it can be reused. We have various setback mitigations for pesticide use from sensitive receptors, open air area, extraction area setbacks, to deal with the odors that are associated with extraction. And those, again, are from sensitive receptors, schools, libraries, alcohol and drug treatment centers. In terms of dealing with emissions, implement TDM. TDM is total daily. Mobile emissions. Transformation demand management measures, which are trip reduction measures, such as carpooling, encouraging carpooling in the urban areas, particularly where we have some indoor grows, having bike lockers, and trying to reduce the overall trips, as that is one of the main impacts of this whole program. When it comes to biotic resources, the way that we deal with biotic resources, and this is something that in a lot of cases, we have already had a lot of the disturbance in sites that are established and want to remain established. In other areas, they're going to be moving into new locations and doing new clearing. The way we address this is the resource planners from the licensing department will be doing pre-screening to determine whether there is some sort of sensitive habitat present based on the county code. And if there is, there'll be a requirement that a biotic assessment is conducted by an independent third-party biologist. That report will come to the planning department, the licensing department for review. Licensing will review the report and implement recommendations based on those reports and can add to them if they feel that they're incomplete. Those reports will address issues such as if you already have an established site, for example, in Chaparral, it will be, if the site is approved, and there's a lot of factors coming into whether a site is approvable or not, but if it is determined that that site can be approved, the chaparral will have to be restored to a certain extent. There'll be management of invasive non-natives as a requirement of the permit. And one of the things we've seen at a lot of the sites is broom takes in on these areas that are cleared. Broom management is going to be a key component to a lot of existing sites. Likewise, where you're moving from one site to another, there'll be a restoration plan required for moving off of a site, so that these sites that we don't have legacy grow sites with sprouting weeds everywhere. Those are going to be components of a license, that they have to restore the areas that they have disturbed, they have to minimize their disturbance area, and new areas will be planned for disturbance before the clearing happens. We recognize that in a lot of cases people have jumped the gun and have done the clearing illegally or anticipating their new site. These sites are going to be addressed with restoration to shrink that down again and have an active long-term management plan to restore as much as feasible the habitat that has been lost. Understanding that there will be some disturbance with an approved site. I see you thinking.
Yeah, I mean, I wish I went through this much more closely. I think that I read that there are some sites that are going to be off limits.
There definitely are.
Can you go over those?
Yeah, so the sandhills, with the exception of some of the old quarries, where the quarries are allowed for reuse under a certain plan, sandhills are going to be off limits for commercial cultivation, and salamander habitat, which really is that between Freedom and Highway 1 and just inland Bonita area down to Buena Vista. Unless it can be really, I believe we've got to avoid impacts to salamander habitat.
Setbacks to ponds.
There are setbacks. The way that we've identified at the county and with Fish and Wildlife Service, all the breeding ponds that we know are breeding ponds, and all the ones that are potential that we have evidence that there are salamanders around. And we've shown that through studies, salamanders will go 90% of them will not go more than 1,000 feet from the pond. So there's a quarter-mile circumference around each pond that is anticipated to house these fully protected state species. That's the area that we don't want to encourage any new disturbance, land disturbance, clearing, any new activities that could impact those species. There's also a mitigation to avoid oak woodlands, and oak woodlands really are hard to define when just by calling. I mean, it's easy to picture an oak woodland, but when you're actually out in the field and you have 2 oaks in a stand of madrone, is that an oak woodland? What kind of oak is it? So that's really going to come down to the assessments to determine whether there is an oak woodland and whether it can be avoided.
And who makes that assessment?
That will be the third-party biologist, and that may happen in consultation with a forester. The state requires impacts to oak woodland to be determined by a registered forester. And there are foresters that we have on retainer that can do that work. Let's see. Fencing, we're looking at impacts and biotics. And this goes back to the initial fencing. If you have a couple acre site and you put a fence, solid fence all the way around it, you've just created a barrier to wildlife or created paths for wildlife that can lead to predation. So we want to make sure that when we do require fencing, that it's fencing that we can allow some wildlife to pass through or can be directed to channels through. I know that there are issues with wildlife and cultivation as well, and so the fencing plan is really going to have to address both of those issues.
Can we go back for a second?
Sure.
I didn't realize we skipped ahead. In habitat compensation, the first sentence says, where avoidance of species-sensitive habitat is demonstrated to be infeasible, compensatory mitigation for permanent impacts, blah, 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 blah. So it seems like there could be an argument to be made that if you can't avoid the sensitive species, maybe that location should just be taken off the table.
That argument can be made, but in a lot of cases, we already have an established grow and we already have the impact.
Like an illegal grow or one that's
Or
under
one
7.128?
one that's been trying to be legal, that has been following the rules, and that's where we've had this quasi, you're allowed to grow 100 plants, but it's not legal, but we're not going to enforce, where we've kind of allowed people to establish, and the Chaparral is a perfect example of that. We've allowed grows to happen up there without saying, no, you can never do this, and at this point, pulling them out creates large open areas that will be taken over by broom. We have to weigh again, if the site for other reasons can be approved, then we'll get restoration as much as we can from this on-site as possible.
And then going forward to the pest management plan section,
Yes.
that's on 6-13 for everybody else. So my understanding was that the use of rodenticides is not an approved pesticide to use with cannabis cultivation. This section seems to make it sound like it can be approved.
This is a fine line. We're not allowed to say that you cannot use it. So what we can do is, and what we've recommended as a mitigation measure, is that you show that nothing else is working. You try everything else, but we can't say you can't use it. So we say try everything else, and then you can. It should be pointed out that state law may disallow it.
Oh, so the state law has not disallowed it yet?
State law has not allowed it. Federal law has not allowed it. And
It's not allowed federally, so therefore for cannabis.
right,
Yeah. So
it's not been approved to be used.
So it is not allowed?
It is not allowed. It is not an approved use
It's-
for cannabis.
So that's confusing, because if it's not allowed, we should just say it's not allowed, right?
Right, except that if we say it's not allowed,
Or can we just say the federal government says it's not allowed? I mean, we don't have to say we're not allowing it, but whatever context does not allow it,
yeah,
I feel like we should say that.
I think you're right. We can be clearer on that, definitely.
Okay.
And
But that
maybe Juan
clears
can
that
speak to this.
Good morning, Juan Hidalgo, I'm the Ag Commissioner.
Thank you.
So the rodenticide issue is a little bit confusing. Technically, there isn't a rodenticide that's allowed on cannabis cultivations at this point. However, if you have an indoor cultivation, you could potentially set out bait stations outside, and that would actually be an allowed use. So currently, local governments cannot pass any restrictions on regulating pesticide use. So if you were to say you cannot allow rodenticide uses on cannabis cultivations, that's up to the state to make those determinations. So that's where it gets a little bit tricky.
So there are some
Okay.
areas where you can use it.
So it sounds like if you have an indoor greenhouse grow, you can use rodenticides,
Outside of the greenhouse.
right, which is,
Or you
Right.
can, yeah,
Or if you have a warehouse, if somebody has a cultivation site in a warehouse, potentially you could bait outside that warehouse. It would be just like any other business. If you go to a food place, food storage place, they usually have bait boxes outside the buildings. It would be a similar scenario. That one thing you would not be able to do if you have an outdoor cultivation. Right now, there isn't any materials that allow people to use rodenticides in those sites for any agricultural uses.
Okay, it sounds like kind of a gray
It
area.
is, and
I
so-
think we should work on trying to make it clear.
And that's one of the reasons that the mitigation says that when it comes to using rodenticide, try everything else first. And through that process, we're going to be reviewing their plan. We're going to be reviewing whether they're proposing to do it or not. We're going to be making sure that the way they propose to use it is legal, per the state, per the feds as well. So I think the mitigation, I think we can definitely make it clear in terms of explaining when it can and can't be used, where it can and can't be used. But I think our mitigation really allows us to determine at least what people are proposing to do. And again, the misuse of that, if we find that they are putting rodenticide outdoors in an outdoor grow or indoors in an indoor grow where it's not allowed, that can have them lose their license. So it's definitely, there is definitely a good reason for them to have a plan and to follow the plan.
And if I can add to it, so any business that's going to be using pesticides for commercial purposes, such as a cannabis cultivator, they have to come to the Ag Commissioner's office, and essentially they have to get a permit from us. So a lot of what we do is reaching out to agricultural producers, and in this case, we would be working with cultivators so that they understand what the requirements are for using pesticides properly and correctly. And that's one of the things that we would be addressing with them, the proper use of rodenticides, and assessing whether or not, depending on the type of operation, that's something that they could use or not. But I think education is going to be a key component. This is an industry that is not your regular agricultural operator out there. There's going to be a lot of education that's going to be necessary to work with these folks about pesticide use requirements, not just about rodenticides, but many of the other materials that are not allowed for cannabis cultivation.
So your office or you have some discretion in saying whether or not a cultivator could use a rodenticide?
There's no discretion, it's more about reading the label, and the label actually will indicate when and where you can use that material. So it's more of providing that information to the cultivators so that they understand what the label says. And in cases where the label clearly says you cannot use this material for those purposes, we make that clear. And we'll be working with the state at the same time, the Department of Pesticide Regulation. That's one of the issues that they're going to be tackling here in the future, trying to figure out what pesticides can be used for cannabis cultivation.
But right now, someone said that it's not allowed for cannabis cultivation. Is that right? I guess I'm just confused.
Right now, there's no registered rodenticide labels that say you can use rodenticides on cannabis cultivation sites.
So does that mean it's not allowed?
That means if you have a site that's cultivated and you put bait boxes in that site, you can't do that right now.
Okay.
However, if you have a building, that's a different situation, because usually those bait stations are not inside the cultivation site, they're outside. That's the way most bait boxes are used, to put them outside the building to prevent the rodents from coming inside your building. So
Not sure that makes sense, but
So
yeah.
you can't put them directly by the plants, you can
Right.
put them outside the building.
right.
Which maybe is worse, I don't know.
Which then,
Well, then, one of the issues, I think, and we've had the conversation before with Juan, is that a lot of the pesticide regulation comes through the federal government, and cannabis isn't legal under
Right.
the federal law, so none of it's been tested or anything like that, so it's
I
not
get it.
really licensed to be used on that particular crop.
Mm-hmm.
I think this is
Right.
an issue that the zoning part of the puzzle is not addressing, number one. I think that the ag department should be in the middle of this, because currently, to Ellen's point, there's no pesticides that are actually available for use on cannabis, but it's the ag department's responsibility to issue pesticide permits and reports And if these people don't have to report any usage, they can do whatever they want. And I don't see why they should be any different than any other grower out there in that respect.
Well, I think from what we've heard is that the rodenticides with cannabis can have different impacts than other crops, and that's what we've been hearing from, especially in the mountain areas, that it has an impact on, you know, the fox that eats the rat, and then the mountain lion that eats the fox, and they've been finding rodenticides in those animals. So anyway, it's I think that obviously it's an issue we need to iron out as we move forward, but thanks. I'm a little bit more clear, and thank you, Juan.
And there will be coordination between Juan and Robin's department as well.
Okay, great, thanks.
We
I don't need to-
definitely see that this is an issue that is, that particularly coming from a community that has been in the shadows, that has not been the agricultural community,
Right.
there's a lot of education that needs to happen in terms of what their requirements are in order to actually cross that line to being fully legal. So we're doing outreach to the community as well to educate them through the licensing program.
Well, I think if you incorporate some of these Department of Agricultural, ag commissioner type issues, it would make your job easier too.
Yeah, I agree. I'm going to move forward through some of the biotic mitigations. We do have mitigations for nesting bird surveys prior to disturbance, a pest management plan, which we've gone over. One of the other big impacts of this whole industry, and we've looked at total build-out, the water use. Water use is going to be not only just for irrigation, but also for, in the rural areas, for firefighting purposes. There's going to be a lot of water required to be drawn. And both the state and the county has concerns about impacts to streams as a result of wells near streams pulling out water or in-stream diversions. So we are coordinating with the Fish and Game and the regional water for some of that. We do have a restriction on if there are sites that have an approved water source that's directly or indirectly connected to a fish-bearing stream, water can't be pulled between mid-October and mid-April. So the water can only be pulled, between October and April. So we're pulling water during the winter months and not allowing water during the summer months when the aquifers get depressed. That should help alleviate some of it. There are other measures to try and reduce the impacts of water, such as a requirement to maximize rainwater harvesting and storage, to provide on-site storage both for fire needs and irrigation needs. So water is really something that we've thought long and hard about on how to reduce that impact, knowing that is one of the major impacts we've seen from all the illegal grows, is particularly the straight in-stream diversions. That I know that the state is particularly targeting the diversions and the wells that are near streams, and we're trying to push that out a little bit more. Let's move on. Oak Woodlands community replacement, we've discussed. Wildlife fencing, we discussed. We will review every license to ensure that it doesn't conflict with an HCP, an existing one. Part of that is the Sandhills. That's the one major HCP we have countywide, but there are also a lot of individual HCPs, properties that had an HCP in order to build their house because they have some particular habitat on site. We're going to make sure that there's no conflicts there before any license is issued. We discussed the Sandhills and salamander protection zones and the rodenticide reduction and control plan, which again includes opportunities for public outreach and education, which I think is going to be the most effective factor there is the outreach. And that's got to be pretty broad, going to all the ACE hardwares as well as the growers and the ag industry. Because that impact comes not just from cannabis cultivation. We recognize that having a lot of new grows out in the woods has had a pretty profound impact on animals, but the house that I moved into had rat bait that was set out just in the move because rats had moved into the vacant house, and that's a common factor in the mountains, that people just bait and leave. So that's, while it's beyond the scope of the EIR, the education should help with that as well. Hydrology and water quality, we get into, again, pesticide, herbicide, rodenticide control. That'll be part of that plan. The cleanup and restoration for relocated activities, I've already discussed. Water efficiency, so the way, in looking at how much water is used per plant in this industry, the numbers are all over the map. You have people who grow on adjoining parcels, and one might use as much as up to, on average, 6 gallons a day, and one might use 1 gallon a day, and they get similar yields. So there is a lot of range in what the amount of water you can use. When you go indoor, you typically have climate control, and so you've got dehumidifiers, which are pulling water out of the air, which create quite a bit more water demand from the plant. So we've really kind of looked at the best numbers we can in terms of what can be done to minimize water use. When you do have dehumidifiers, you're recapturing all the water that comes out of that and recirculating it. Again, rainwater harvesting to help offset the demand from the whether it's municipal or wells. But the water efficiency will be really, there'll be a plan for it. We'll review it. We'll make sure that growers are being as efficient as possible. And I think the industry really is going to move more towards a more efficient. I don't think that, particularly once growers are having to pay for water and collect as much water as they can, they're going to try and be as efficient as possible. We're going to allow for, encourage the combined use of tanks. When you have grows that are near each other, it's a lot cheaper to put down 1,000 feet of pipe to go from one tank to feed 3 different sites rather than have 3 tanks, 1 for each site. So with the fire requirements, the amount of flow required for a structure that is in a, that is not on a municipal water supply can be over 100,000 gallons. That's just for water. You also have your irrigation needs. You also have your house needs. So we're going to try and encourage as much combined use as possible to minimize the draw that happens to fill all these tanks. Public lands restriction, one of the things that in hindsight actually kind of made me chuckle, we have a restriction that you cannot be within 300 feet of a public park or 600 feet of a public park in certain areas. But we never said in the ordinance that you cannot grow in a public park. So we have a mitigation to say you cannot grow in a public lands. We have a similar mitigation for the SU district. The original intent of including the SU district was to allow cultivation on the special use parcels that have an underlying general plan designation that would otherwise allow it. And we didn't clarify that, so that mitigation really is a clarifier to say that we're not including the SU that are public parks or that are other uses, residential. The underlying general plan has to be an allowed use. So that is a cleanup. Another cleanup with the urban and rural services line allowance. The master planned cannabis facilities is again the shared use of infrastructure, as well as and another of the large impacts from this that we foresee if people are getting legal out in the rural areas are a lot of roads that are going to be 20 feet wide with very large turn radiuses in order to meet the requirements to get a large fire truck out there. So we're going to, as much as possible, because the licensing office does know who's getting licenses in nearby, will help coordinate with those people to do shared infrastructure. If a new road is going in, it should be one that can access two properties rather than one to minimize that impact. Yeah, along with that, with the roads and seeing that is a potential huge impact, we're amending the code and the general plan to give some discretion to deny permits that are going to have excessive grading. And an example of this is where you have an access road that is currently a 10, 12 foot wide, barely minimum road that is on a steep slope. And in order to make it 20 feet wide, you're either doing a massive cantilever project or you're doing a massive grading project to cut back that hillside. There are certain areas where widening a road to 20 feet does not have a major impact. But in areas where you're going to be doing thousands of yards of grading, creating 15, 20-foot cut faces, we want to be able to deny those to reduce that impact of grading. There is a whole slew of best management practices that will be required to the maximum extent feasible. And some of these are already discussed in terms of rainwater harvesting, limiting the work times to not disturb neighbors.
Did you develop those, or are those practices that have been previously developed?
Best management practices are previously ones that have been added to by us. We've taken lists from other jurisdictions. We've reviewed those. They originally came as a recommendation from the consultants, and we've done some tweaking to it here and there to make it cannabis specific.
Sorry, are those agricultural best practices?
Yes.
From government sources or independent sources?
In a lot of cases, cannabis specifically. So there's been a lot of work done by CDFW, a Regional Water Quality Control Board, to basically derive best management practices that are akin to agricultural practices but are targeted to cannabis specifically and address that range of issues.
Okay, thank you.
So some of them, I'm not going to go through them all, but there are work limits, and you can read these work limits in terms of seasonal ground disturbance. We don't want people grading in the rain. Work hours to ensure that people aren't working pre-dawn and post-sunset. Training for the people who are going to be working on site in terms of whether they do have sensitive habitat there. If there may be certain critters that coming through. Red-legged frog is one that travels a long way. We want to make sure that people understand what may be around. Basic sediment control, erosion control measures, identified staging and storage areas so that sites don't get people parking all over the place. There'll be spill containment, restrictions on open pipes and open trenches so we don't get critters entrained. Definitely specific areas for spoils, for waste management. That'll be part of the waste management plan. Riparian buffers will be a standard part of the plan. Revegetation, as I spoke to, in areas that have been expanded prior to license that don't need to be will be revegetated, or sites that have been, when you're moving from one site to another. And the list goes on. Litter control, green waste management, water conservation, renewable energy sources to the maximum extent feasible, energy conservation measures. There is one that is for organic cultivation and permaculture, to maximize the use of. So we're not going to require that people do all permaculture, all organic cultivation, but we're going to encourage it as much as possible. Part of that plays into the uses, the pesticide and herbicides that are not approved kind of go hand in hand to, as much as possible, avoid the use of them. Moving on into the population and housing, there'll be affordable housing fee for agricultural buildings that are used for commercial cannabis. That will help offset some of the impacts to the housing. We recognize with traffic, we cannot mitigate all impacts of traffic, but where transportation impact fees are applicable, they will be paid. Where rural roads associations or CSAs are part of the roads that are being used by cannabis users, private roads, they'll be required to be members and to help support those agencies. And again, waste management and adequate access roadway design will be working. One of the things that we found in looking at the requirements for roadway width, there is not flexibility when it comes to a fire code standard on the books. There are certain fire agencies that have at times allowed smaller, narrower roads, but they will not commit to allowing that on any case. So we cannot as a program, say that the road standards will be reduced. However, we will work with the fire agencies, with the different county departments to ensure that the roadway width is what it needs to be to meet the requirement for cannabis and fire up to the 20-foot requirement. And those are most of the mitigation. Those are pretty much all the mitigations. We don't have the mitigations in hard copy. We do have them, they are all online on the appendices, sorry. The appendices are all online on the website, which has the website up there.
Thank you, Matt. Are there any questions based on that presentation?
I just,
Yeah, Melanie.
thank you for all the information. In terms of the mechanics of the program, so there's a fixed finite number of licenses that will be available, is that correct?
That's not entirely correct. There is a fixed number of applicants who registrants,
Right.
and then there are farmers. And farmers do not need to have registered in order to apply for a license. So we do not know how many farmers will apply. What we've anticipated is there will be a fair number. The primary agricultural region is not suitable, is not great for outdoor growing, so we anticipate a lot of that will be in the underutilized greenhouses.
So what was the number for existing people who are doing it right now? What is that number?
43, what they want to do in the future.
It's in terms of the number of applicants,
Yes. Mhm.
I believe we have 594 applicants.
And then you'd add to that
Currently
whatever farmers want to do it.
Right.
Uh-huh. Okay, and then I just am curious, I mean, I'm realizing the broad range from this presentation of all the different factors involved, and I'm just curious what the ramp-up is going to be to start to issue licenses, because it sounds like there's going to be quite a bit of work that's going to need to be done before the first license is issued. Can you just briefly tell me what that estimate is?
I don't know that there's a specific estimate, but a lot of it actually depends on what the state is doing as well as what we're doing here locally. The state has said that they will be in a position to issue initial licenses January 2nd, but we don't expect that they're going to be anything like fully situated, and fully ready to do that. So there might be some initial steps taken, but we don't believe the state is going to be, ready to be issuing licenses full bore at that time. We will have completed the environmental review. The board will have worked through the specific regulatory program. And at that point, we also will be positioned to begin to do the individual review and accept license applications. And I don't know at what date all of those hundreds of registrants will have licenses in hand, but we'll have our mechanisms in place, similar to the way the state will be positioned.
And just to point out that if there is any other permit needed, a zoning permit because they're building a new building or what have you, they'll have to apply for those permits as well and have those approved before they can be granted a license.
Thank you.
Anything else? I'm going to allow the public to one more opportunity to come and address the commission.
My name's Bob Culbertson, and I'm on the Commission on the Environment. And a lot of our initial concerns had to do with what has happened with illegal grows in this county in terms of stream diversion, erosion, illegal pesticides, and lots of different kinds of impacts, a lot of which we've been talking about in terms of mitigations. My general question, which we haven't really discussed on the commission, is that we've had this flourishing industry in this county on raising marijuana. This hasn't been legal. So the fact that it wasn't legal, the fact that they were oftentimes growing on somebody else's land, and they had to campaign against marijuana. The sheriff spent a lot of time finding grows and tearing them apart, not finding perpetrators, but finding the impacts left behind after a grow. When I was superintendent of Big Basin, we had an illegal grow inside the state park, which we discovered when we did a controlled burn. We accidentally found where a stream diversion was occurring and marijuana was being grown way off trail underneath some redwoods, totally illegal. So, yeah, I know on public lands, they have had grows, and as we talk about all the limits you're putting on people and the requirements, which are all good, we want this to stop. We want the best management practices. We want people to be licensed, and to be licensed, there's a limited number of people that are going to be licensed. They're going to have to go through all these hoops we've been talking about. There's still a possibility that there'll be another group of people who say, I'm not going to go through all those hoops. I've been making my money this way, and I'm going to continue to do things illegally. So there's a possibility that we're still going to have illegal grows, illegal activity parallel to the legal and customized grows. So my question is, do we have something like an incentive for people to go through the licensing and all the hoops? When they finish with a product, are they going to get some kind of a seal of approval when they have their product made? Are people that want to buy legal marijuana for medical use or recreational use nowadays going to know that it was grown correctly, that it was grown responsibly? Is there some other kind of incentive for somebody besides the fact that they're going to be issued a license and allowed to relicense? Is there going to be some other encouragement for a grower to grow things properly and not to grow things illegally? Is there some other punishment other than somebody getting a misdemeanor ticket when they have discovered that they've grown something illegally?
Well, I'll defer to staff, but my understanding is that if somebody's found to be growing illegally, it's a felony. So that's the incentive, that you'd be arrested, right?
At this point, it's not. It's a misdemeanor, unless there's other extenuating circumstances. If they have an illegal stream diversion, it becomes a felony. If they're illegal using pesticides on their crops, it becomes a felony.
If you're growing over 100 plants, it's not a felony?
Manufacturer still has a felony. Volatile.
Yeah.
So if there's an unpermitted grow that conforms with our county ordinance, it's a misdemeanor? Okay.
But typically, there are environmental crimes associated with those grows, and then they would, the DA would be looking at enhanced felony.
If you can find them.
So back to addressing Mr. Culbertson's question, though, will there be any incentive or marketing advantage for someone who's legal as opposed to someone that is operating at the misdemeanor level? Because certainly it sounds to me like that would be, from a strictly business perspective, if there's no incentive for me to be legal, then why would I be?
If you are illegal, you cannot be selling through the dispensaries, so you'll be selling on the black market. In order to legally sell, it has to come from there. It will be monitored from seed to flower that it is legal. There is no certification process that the county has envisioned in terms of anything like a organic or green label. I know that there are third parties in the industry who are discussing this, and there are a few labs that do testing, and I know that there is a movement out there to create something like this. And we would definitely work with them as much as we can, but at this point, it hasn't been contemplated. Loretta.
For the government trailer bill, the state trailer bill is providing for point of origin, like wine gets. So Santa Cruz grown is something that they're promoting in the new legislation. So then you'll have that label, which will be sacred to Santa Cruz. But branding it and promoting it as
Appellation.
Great. Is there anyone else from the public who'd like to address the commissions? Okay, great.
Hello, good morning. Pat Mela served on the C4 committee where we grappled with many of these issues for 7 months. And I'm so happy that the EIR has come out like it does and has recognized the impacts of the unregulated mess from all perspectives that we're trying to bring in the C4s. Thinking about it, it was cast a wide net and pull people into compliance. And so a lot of the comments today have been describing, semi-accurately that unregulated mess, and then also describing accurately the challenges of bringing people into regulation. And like it or not, I've come to understand that the only solution to an unregulated mess is regulation. And so, the challenge is what, we talked carrots and sticks in the C4 all day long. And the challenge is that the sticks have been taken away. And so what kind of carrots? We need a carrot that's as big as the stick used to be, right? And that's the only way to get them there. And so I spend a lot of my time interacting and organizing with the cannabis community. And so the idea of that people came to Santa Cruz, or I grew up in Santa Cruz and was blessed to be a part of this, but they came here because we were leading the way in starting the baby steps towards regulation as much as we could. And some of the group that we have out there of people who have been taking every step they can to remain regulated, and like Matt described, the one big carrot of this is that you get to still remain in the regulated market. Because one of the other side effects of not bringing people into this regulated market is saying no, for the first time in some of these people's lives, you have to go deal in the black market. And so it's not all just criminals who are just happy to not pay their taxes. There are real associated risks with being in the black market, and we don't want to push people who are attempting to follow the laws into that box. And there was jokes about the residential zone and things, but the residential zone is really where we have this problem right in our face, and I think we haven't been able to look at it yet, is that unfortunately, the answer to unregulated cannabis in residential neighborhoods is regulated cannabis in residential areas. And so I don't like, say it that loud because it's so uncomfortable to think, but that's where we're going with this logic. And I think the EIR has shown a historical fact that, this might be one of the first EIRs to show that doing nothing has more impact than doing something. So, thank you.
Is there anyone else from the public who'd like to address the commissions? Okay, seeing no one, I think that concludes our meeting. Thank you, everybody, for coming. And again, just a reminder, there's another public meeting on October 2nd. Thank you.